All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the longest running show in the world about data. It's called DM Radio. Yours truly, Eric Kavanaugh here, and an all-star cast lined up for you folks. We're going to talk about the foundation of the information economy, which of course is database. Why cloud databases will prevail. Persist this is our little joke, because of course persistence, that's what databases do. They persist data. You can do it other ways though these days. You can stream data. You don't even have to persist it, although oddly enough, technologies like Kafka do first persist data to disk, even though they're streaming. So there's all sorts of interesting twists going on out there. But cloud databases have really taken off, especially in the last 5 years or so. But all those traditional databases, they're still out there, and lots of them are open source. A lot of really interesting things happening in the open source community, but don't count out the veterans in the world either. You've got Teradata on the call today. We have MariaDB on the call today. Fun show about, or fun topic, MariaDB. I love this technology. The guy who started it, Monty Vidanius, I interviewed him about 4 years ago, and I remember when Oracle bought Sun, and with it MySQL, Monty Vidanius forked the open source project into MariaDB. Like the next day after Oracle bought this technology. And I remember asking myself, all right, what's going to happen here? Is it going to be hard to get MySQL free anymore? And the short answer was, yeah, kind of. They kind of hid it behind some things. You can go still download the binaries, as they say, and install it yourself. But things did change a bit. But I'm always fascinated by that tale that the guy who invented this just forked the open source project the next day, and that's how MariaDB was born. So we'll find out about that and other things. But basically, you think about a database, it stores data, it delivers data. You want it to be fast, you want it to be responsive. These days, if you do online shopping, you want all that stuff to come to you very, very quickly. If you're looking through different objects that you want to buy, different products, for example, you want to be able to get to them quickly, find out if they're available, order them, do all that stuff in a very seamless fashion. Well, that requires a database that's fast, that can hold lots and lots of information and deliver all that information, that can handle lots of different queries coming from different directions. So there are lots of things that come into what make a database good and fast and reliable and durable and so forth. And we're going to talk about all that today. And with that, let's bring in Tony Baer, one of my best friends in the business. This guy knows his stuff. He's been in the industry for a number of years now, a fantastic writer. Tony, tell us about the latest and greatest in the database world. Will cloud databases prevail over on-prem, or does on-prem have a long tail?
Oh, gosh. Hi, Eric. No, thank you for having me again. Great talking with you. My answer really on that is, where do we start? And what's, part of it is that I had, my background originally, before I got into technology, was both in, my degrees were in history and journalism. So I've always looked at everything as being, well, let's, report on the latest, but then, let's look at the back history. And didn't this happen before? And what you see in the world of data and databases is essentially what goes around comes around. It's just that on each new go around, we have some new ideas. We can take advantage of some new technology and do some old things in new ways. And so the idea of distributed databases, we've been talking about that for 30 years in the cloud. You can do distributed databases, and we've and you can by virtue of basically in cloud native, where you separate essentially data from compute, there are a lot of ways that you can distribute databases or basically or split workloads, shard databases. So there are a lot of, and you can also split between batch and real-time streaming. So a lot of amazing things that you can do with it. So where are we? Where do we start? Well, I would say that we're about 10 years into what's really the revolution in databases. We thought about 20 years ago that we could have closed down the patent office. But at year 2000, we thought that relational databases were the end state, until we found out that, well, there's just that when with the way relational databases work, they put a logical layer over how data is stored, which is great, for doing queries and for governing and all that. But when it came to absolute scale, it became an impediment. And so basically, folks like Google and Amazon and Facebook and Yahoo started looking at different ways that they could persist data, and found that Well, sometimes we could work with a variable structure. Sometimes we can work with key. If we're just doing counters, we can have a key value store. If we're trying to process documents, we can borrow a construct from web developers called JSON, JavaScript object notation. It was devised, for the web, and the database folks say, hey, we could use this construct as like a poor man's object database. And what I've always said was that relational databases are the way that the world is structured, but document databases are the way that the world actually is, because the world tends to form in hierarchies and stuff like that. Where we are today is that we're in the midst of a cloud transition. And as we were talking about before we came online, on-premise will not go away. It will be a continuum. There's some data that will have to stay on premises, or there are going to be some applications that if it ain't broke, why fix it? But they will have to interact with data and analytics that that are more likely than not to be in the cloud. So I see a continuum happening in all this. The other part, though, is that we do see a real secular trend that enterprises are looking at. Can we afford to keep maintaining data centers and put all the sweat equity, the blood and toil into those data centers? And a lot of enterprises are saying, this is not a business we need to be in. So we are definitely seeing a distinct move to the cloud. As I said, the future will be hybrid, and the future will be multi-cloud, not necessarily by design, but by default. And what's really interesting, and I'll kind of leave off with this, is not meant to be an end statement, but just to kind of show that what goes around comes around, is that we're seeing a revolution now in data lakes. The whole thing with big data, hey, schema on read. Well, turns out that if you're really trying to do scalable analytics, and if you're really trying to get governed data, and also if you want to make sure you get consistently the right data, it helps to have that form that in a relational format. So we now have this new construct called the data lakehouse, which I see as being the revenge of the SQL nerds. So in terms of where we're going, I see that essentially it's going to be 1,000 flowers will bloom, and that also we're kind of going through a cycle, and we're starting to see, I think, basically a renaissance in relational databases.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I think it is a renaissance in database technology, and it is a very significant thing, right? So people want choices. And, I remember writing about this way back in 2005, and I'll throw this back over at you, Tony, before we bring it out of the guests. But I remember watching this whole Hadoop movement and really kind of scratching my head about what was going on, because it seemed a bit kludgy to me, and like there'd have to be a whole lot of reverse engineering going on. It sort of dawned on me that this whole arising of open source databases was really a whole bunch of people trying to get a piece of Larry Ellison's pie, just tired of dealing with the big vendors for their database technologies. And so you had this real proliferation of open source projects that is now very significantly matured. But what do you think?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, there's no question. I mean, certainly a lot of this started as a reaction against kind of like the established order. But I see open source also in another way, which is that it's a matter of skills base. And so I think the secret of success of MySQL, which is still out there, MariaDB, Postgres especially, is that is building a very large skills base that's not restricted to any specific vendor product or implementation. And so, and the other thing is that developers, whether database developers or application developers, or whether they're data engineers or data scientists, they all want on their resumes open source, because that will make their skills portable. And that's also where the brunt of the innovation is happening.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, let's bring in other guests. We got Robin Jessani of Teradata and Manjot Singh of MariaDB. Ladies first. I'll throw it over to Robin Jessani. Tell us a bit about what you're working on. Of course, Teradata has been around for a long, long time and has innovated in lots of different ways. Last time I went to a Teradata conference was, I think, 2019. And I remember being very impressed by the industry solutions, because, in our industry, we get all excited about the speeds and feeds and all the sort of intricacies of the relational models, et cetera. The business people just want analytics quickly. That's all they care about. They don't worry about what happens under the cover as long as it works and gets the job done. So I thought that was an interesting pivot. And then, of course, Vantage Cloud is really a very interesting innovation. Tell us a bit about that and what you folks are working on.
Oh, well, thanks so much, Eric. Yeah, so we have Vantage Cloud, which has two different editions, right? We have our Vantage Cloud Enterprise, which has been in the market for a number of years, and our latest edition, Vantage Cloud Lake, which is the product that I work on primarily. And it's a really exciting place to be because it's a reimagining of our database and our data and analytics platform. And as part of that, to your point earlier, we're really focused on enabling the business users, the data scientists and engineers to all get faster decisions, better ROI as quickly as possible. And so we've built on our innovation of history and scalability and performance and continuous innovation, and are now bringing another layer with ClearScape Analytics, a whole layer of a robust feature set that gives analysts the ability to run analytics in database for better and faster decisions and faster ROI. So really exciting to be on a cloud native platform that enables all of this to happen.
Yeah, no, that is interesting stuff. And maybe tell us real quick about the genesis of Vantage. If I recall correctly, Teradata took a handful of really smart people, said, go into this room and work on this for a period of time and come out with something great. Isn't that kind of how it all came to pass?
It did. We did have an incubation project for Vantage Cloud, and I was very happy to be a part of that. It was probably the best couple of years of my career in my 30-year span here at Teradata. And we, redesigned, right? Like, what do we need to do? What are the market requirements that we need to be able to make? And, obviously the separation of compute and storage is key, one of the key ones, being able to leverage the native object store with our cloud service partners, being able to have independent, multi-cluster scalable compute, right? Independent of the storage, all of these key design criteria, and figuring out how to enable that cloud native architecture based on all of the greatness that's already part of the Teradata Analytics database, and then bring new feature functionality to life on top of it is a great program.
Well, yeah, and also I think it kind of speaks to an awareness at Teradata that the world was changing, that this concept of a centralized data warehouse will still have tremendous value in certain use cases, but that the world is very federated these days, and it really pays to understand that from a programmatic perspective. Is that about right?
Absolutely. Our customers and lots of prospects today are looking for solutions that have different design patterns. Obviously data warehouse is still very primary and prominent in our industry, but a lot of customers want a data lake or want a data lake house, as Tony mentioned before. And really what we're doing is we're enabling customers to implement their analytics and their design pattern of choice based on our available technology, and being able to bring it all together so that they can achieve their value.
Yeah, that's really good stuff. And let's get Manjot singing before the segment ends here. We got about 4 minutes left. Manjot, I always tell the story about MariaDB because I think that's just a fantastic tale. It's really funny. There was some people at Oracle fuming that happened, I have to believe. But it shows you that open source is a very powerful force. And quite frankly, open source has fundamentally changed how enterprise software is designed, deployed, and managed, right? What do you think, Manjot?
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned Monty and how we started MariaDB. But we took that innovation that helped create the web as we know it, and we made a product that everyone from mom and pops to Fortune 500s rely on, right? It's one of the most popular databases out there. It's available on any cloud. But what they're doing, and this is one of the things that you see with a lot of open source, is they take our community version and they host it. But we've taken that innovative modern database and we've made it available in a second generation multi-cloud architecture. And we have a hyper focus on innovation, stability, and those enterprise requirements.
Yeah, no, that's some pretty interesting stuff. And so there is a sort of more durable version. I mean, with open source, you can go and download the code yourself. You can install it. I mean, I remember years ago, just so I could say I did it, I went and worked on standing up a graph database. This is like 2009, and after about a day and a half, I said, "Yeah, I don't want to do that. I
Yeah.
don't want that to be my life." And of course, we're moving in this low code, no code direction, which if you get down to it was always the idea. Like you want to be able to pull things together visually and not have to hack out code all day. But I do like the low code to pro code mantra I've heard some folks talk about. But we are getting much further along the way in terms of maturation of the industry, in terms of being able to deploy these things fairly easily, right? It's a lot easier to deploy a cloud database today than it was 5 years ago. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's really important actually, and so that's why we look at those first generation clouds from hyperscalers, right? They emphasize that convenience and price, but the second generation cloud from database vendors, it really emphasizes movement beyond that one cloud, right? We don't ignore on-prem implementations. We were talking about that in the green room, and these second generation clouds were able to deliver innovation to the database, and hyperscalers can't do that, right? So we give ultimate flexibility, and we're available to our customers without restrictions across that infrastructure with the AWS and Google Cloud and Azure. And we're not just that open source hosting provider, right? So like going back to your first question, our roots are open source, but we've evolved to be able to handle those critical workloads that Fortune 500s depend on. We have mission critical products that run a company's business, right? Think back to the Taylor Swift incident last year. And I think they were expecting something like 1.5 million users, and they had 14 million users, right? And that caused a snowball effect after their system crashed, and it's actually gotten to lawmakers that see a larger issue within their industry. So what they did was they took the heartbeat of their business, and it became a weakness because they didn't give it the attention it needed by using something like what we offer, right? Whether that's Expand, our distributed SQL, or one of our other mission critical products. I think that's a weakness with the open source hosting you get from some of these hyperscalers.
That's interesting. That's a really good point. And that's a great story to throw out there, folks. We'll pick this up after the break. But the story of Taylor Swift and the ticket system crashing, it reminds me actually of during the pandemic when some of these states, their unemployment systems just crashed and burned. And it's like, well, that's not good, right? It's because they have legacy technology. They haven't updated. They didn't pay attention. They didn't dot I's and cross T's. And we expect more from government and from Taylor Swift's companies that she works with. And we'll be right back. Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, folks, welcome back once again to DM Radio. Persist this, why cloud databases will prevail. We're talking to Tony Baer of DBInsights, Robin Jessani of Teradata, and Manjot Singh of MariaDB. And we were talking in the break about scaling down. There's scaling up, of course, and just to explain to our audience, when Black Friday comes, great song by Steely Dan, by the way, all this activity hits, and companies want to be able to scale up or out, depending upon how you do it, to handle that workload, to handle the traffic. But you also want to be able to scale back down. And this is not a new thing. We've been working on this for quite a number of years, but we're finally getting somewhere. I'll throw it over to Tony to comment on first. It's very important to be able to scale down for cost reasons, right? Because you're throwing money out the window if you're paying for a lot of capacity that you're not using. What do you think, Tony?
I'll put it this way, that's it's a great advertisement for cloud, because basically before cloud, when you were running databases on-prem, you had to basically buy just in case capacity.
Right.
And there were some elaborate, ways around that in the past, which is that vendors would sell you basically, like capacity on demand. In other words, they'll sell you a box of with 10 processors, and you're only turning on, let's say, 6 of them, and then you gradually increase your license. I mean, there are ways around that, but still, that was ultimately a more expensive, by nature, somebody has to pay the price of that extra iron. Whereas, in the cloud, that becomes possible because this is all shared. Now, in a way, as we were talking, basically, before we came on, My belief is that in this business, it's almost nothing new, because in that sense, those same economics really underlied time sharing, which is originally the only way that most companies could do computing, because computers were too expensive. So the thing is that in the cloud, where you can really literally basically go out to hyperscale, and that scale is shared by thousands of customers. Then now it becomes possible to take advantage of all that. But again, you do not, if you depending on what your workload is, if your workload is fairly constant, you'll reserve capacity. It's just like, like with anything, it's like reserving an airline, a plane seat in advance versus you trying to get something on peak. But obviously, if your workloads are going to vary, you don't want to be paying for that maximum capacity year round. So you want to be able to scale down. There are differences today with a lot of platforms. There's some that can scale down to zero, others cannot. But again, you have to look at the characteristics of your workload and kind of match it to what the vendor has available.
Yeah, that's right. It's an ongoing challenge too. And I will say, I'll throw this over to Rob and Jessani, and then we'll see what Manjot has to say about it as well. The big term these days in enterprise computing is observability. Right now, we can see all this stuff, whether it's data pipelines, for example, or much more granular observability into how much things cost, like how much processing time it took, how much does the storage cost. So, even 2-3 years ago, it was very difficult to know what it cost you to run a certain analysis. That's not really so much the case now, and it's really moving very, very quickly. What are your thoughts about this really growing amount of data that we can access to understand the cost of things and what it's actually doing in the enterprise? What do you think, Robin?
So I think that that's a great question. And I know one of the areas that we are really investing heavily in is helping our customers with financial governance, because being able to view all of the telemetry data, how many compute clusters are you running? Are they scaling up and down? Making sure that they are only scaling within the policy thresholds that have been defined, allocating resources, seeing how much storage you have, are all very important. And it's not just for observability, but it's also for predictability. Do I need more resources? Do I need to increase my system size? Do I need to ask one department to change the time of day that they're doing work, right? So there are a lot of decisions that are made, all based on being able to do financial governance and have that easily viewable and understandable in a visual way that through the console. And that's what we're doing with Vantage Cloud Lake, is that we're continuing to enhance customer ability to do financial governance right in the console, so that administrators and users, all users, can see consumption rates and data on what's going on in their environment.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good point. And Manjot, I'll throw this one over to you. There is this new term getting floated around, data mesh. I've been researching this quite a bit. Zhamak Dengali came up with this over at ThoughtWorks, and now she's launched her own company, Next Data. And I will say it is an interesting concept, and there are some core tenets to it. One, treating data as a product, of course, localizing the management of data by department, whoever's using it. And in order to do some of that stuff, well, you need a bit of observability. You need to understand, all right, well, how much is it costing us to have our marketing department run all these segmentations of prospects to do email marketing? How much does that stuff cost? And we're starting to get somewhere. I mean, I know at the Snowflake Summit last year, they talked about resource groups, which is their way of trying to sort of cordon off a group of individuals and be able to track what they're doing and how much that costs. So again, we're getting closer and closer to understanding. What do you think about the implication of this for businesses? And what do you think about it for the maturation of database technology, Manjot?
Yeah, and I hear you, right? Pricing concerns are top of mind for a lot of cloud users. And I think that goes back to observability and things of that nature, right? So we have cross-cloud observability as one of our examples in our, as I called it, a second generation cloud,
Wow.
right? And on-prem observability. So we make those predictable as you use multiple clouds and perhaps your on-prem infrastructure. And resource usage. I think in one of your previous shows, you talked about the cost of a query and how people might be hesitant to run a query if they knew the cost in dollars, right? I found that really a lively conversation. But if you go back to, SkySQL as our second generation cloud, we've found it's actually less expensive and provides more value than a comparable, say, AWS configuration, right? And that, I think, provides good value to our customers. I saw a post from Tony discussing this as well to promote the show. And, for example, if we have a like for like MariaDB community on RDS and we compare that with like SkySQL's MariaDB Enterprise, we give you read replicas and multi-AZ built in, along with features from MaxScale, which is our intelligent router. And that automatically does read-write splitting, transaction replay on failover, among other things. And so I think you find people that have those cloud costs in mind. They look at the facts they get from things like observability platforms, like what we offer, and they'll do something like migrate from Aurora. Like our customers come to expand in the cloud, and they'll save something like 40% over Aurora, right? And they find that better value. So I think you have the value seeking as a consequence of what you were discussing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the more information we get, the better. I'll throw it back over to Tony. It's a constantly moving playing field is the challenge for CIOs and CTOs and CDOs increasingly, because they're the data folks who should have some say in all this. And, from a user perspective, it's kind of hard to track all the different moving parts and how much things are changing. So you kind of have to pick a particular direction and stick with it at least for 6 months to a year before you think about changing and, ripping out databases. Does that ever even happen?
I mean, put it this way, I think the old saying, and I think there's still a lot of truth to this, is you replace the database, then you replace the DBA, because, even though theoretically, say in the relational world, it was all based on essentially, SQL, every database provider had their own flavor of SQL, for good reason, because basically the SQL spec was very was designed to be very general purpose, and there are optimizations, for instance, like what you folks do with MariaDB with expand, in Teradata, in terms of that you have a SQL that's very attuned to basically doing incredibly complex queries and being able to do complex queries and be able to then optimize the query for whatever your priority is, which is, do you want basically high performance, do you want high concurrency, is there going to be a lot of compute involved? And so each provider here, it's actually a good thing, is that it encourages essentially basically a market for innovation, encourages a market of choices. And a great example of that is in the Postgres, Postgres platform, for instance, which we don't have anybody from Postgres here on the show, but I'll give them a little bit of airtime, which is more from the standpoint of, I'm talking about just the way the community was set up, which is that it has one of the most liberal open source licenses out there. And the license basically says, as long as you don't sue the University of California at Berkeley, have at it, kids. Do whatever you want with this platform. And so the result of that, you've seen so many different forks. And in Postgres, fork is a good thing. Fork is basically there synonymous with innovation. And so Postgres, for instance, was not initially designed for analytics. And so there were some players in the Postgres community that basically forked it. To support, for instance, like shared nothing NPP parallel query, just as within MariaDB, within your it was basically a transaction. MySQL, from which it was descended, you were a simple transaction database, and out of that you've come up with high concurrency. You've come up with basically with parallelism, sharding. You've done considerable innovation. As I said, it's the type of thing that, of course, Teradata pioneered years ago, when SQL came out. So the short of this is that I view basically these base technologies as basically platforms for innovation, and therefore, basically, it provides choice.
That's a good way to put it. And Robin, I'll throw it over to you. As one of the veterans in the industry here, and you said you worked on this managed cloud thing very closely, which had to be very exciting stuff. because it to me, it really did represent a tipping point or some sort of significant inflection point in the evolution of the industry, right? And I remember when the data lake thing started to take off, asking myself, are we making the same mistake again, trying to pull all this data in one place like we did in the data warehouse? Shouldn't we respect the federated view of the world and what's going on out there? And said, you know, what you guys bring to the table too is all these different functions that you can bring to bear, right? Because there are lots of different queries you can throw at things. There are lots of different algorithms to use, and you guys have a whole host of those things. You want to talk about that for a minute?
Well, sure. And, you know, as you said, we support many different kinds of workloads. Of course, we're analytics born and raised, and we continue to support analytic innovation, but we also do mixed workloads. So we support operational and tactical work, we support transactional workloads, and we have the mixed workload management capabilities so that we can adequately prioritize and make sure the work is getting processed the way it needs to be. You know, the great thing about Vantage Cloud Lake, the newest innovation, is not only do we have the workload management capabilities, which have been a key strength of ours for years, but now we can do workload isolation. So for companies that want to be able to have different types of query processing, maybe not want to impact SLAs from one group to another, they can actually isolate their work by setting up various compute clusters, all working against the same data. So it's really the best of both worlds. You have workload isolation in conjunction with advanced workload management.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point too. And you want to be able to solve your business users' needs, right? I mean, concurrency is one of the real issues to watch out for, because if you're not set up properly and a whole bunch of people rush in there, you get a Taylor Swift crashing website scenario where no one gets what they want. And that's no fun at all. And Manjot, I'll throw it over to you real quick. I got a couple minutes left in this segment. But what I think is so cool is that now you really can adjust these things, even with simple slider bars. Like, I want to have more concurrency, or I want to have a better control on cost, or I want faster speed with these things. You know, 10 years ago, you couldn't do that, but now you can. And that's very interesting and very compelling from a business perspective, right, Manjot?
Yeah, yeah. And actually that just goes right into what SkySQL offers you today, right? You get scale up and down, but you also get scale out. So we were talking about scale up and down before, but this just goes back to what Tony was saying. As a platform of innovation in that second generation cloud, you can scale out. So like if you use our distributed SQL product, for example, it's a new category of database technology that gives you that sort of best resilience and scale, right? And it's important because we're operating, or the whole world is operating on a level of scale that we haven't seen before. You know, with that Taylor Swift story, for example, we've never seen the type of demand that we see today. And we multiply that across digital entertainment platforms, food delivery apps, travel and booking sites, gambling, right? So the world needs a better way to be resilient in the face of anything and scale to meet that demand. And so Expand redundantly stores data, allowing for database operations to automatically continue in the event of failures. And there's no manual intervention. It's fault tolerant, zone aware, multi-site replication. And then you add those sliders in, and all of a sudden it's adding nodes on Black Friday because you're getting a lot of traffic.
Yeah, and you don't have to call some specialist IT person to go down to the deepest, darkest corner of the data center and work on that stuff for you. It's much easier to manage, and that's the way it should be. I mean, that's the whole purpose of software, is to allow people to do interesting things for their business. And the database should not be a very complex environment. Now, there are still things you can do. I mean, there are still things that a specialist, a really good DBA can do to optimize performance, but a lot of that stuff is being handled dynamically these days, and that's just good news for the business. But don't touch that dial, folks. I'll be right back. You are listening to DM Radio.
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, talking all things database technology, and especially up in the cloud. We've got several guests: Tony Baer, of course, of DBInsights, Robin Jessani of Teradata, and Manjot Singh of MariaDB, which used to be called MySQL back in the day. Now it's MariaDB. And you made a really good point in the break, Manjot, about the DBA, the database administrator. This is a very important job, or certainly was very important for a long, long time. This is the person who sets up your database, who optimizes your database for performance, sets up the indices, does all kind of different things to make sure that things are humming along and doing good work. Well, that job it's not going away, but it's kind of going away. And there are just different skill sets involved now. But you made a really good point about explaining to, let's say, Oracle developers that, hey, you can still do PL SQL and here's how you do it. And you kind of train them. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, I was touching on Tony's previous point on why people may not be as portable with databases, right? They don't want to learn a new syntax, and that's always been important for us. The original MySQL had ANSI SQL compatibility. We've added PL SQL compatibility in 2018, where developers don't have to learn a new syntax. And so when I was a consultant, I would go in and I'd notice DBAs hesitant to go with their leadership direction of changing the database. And I'd say, it's okay. Here's the training. Here's what you need to learn. And here's what you don't need to learn. Here's your transferable skills. And I think when you do that and you see that human factor, it helps people understand what the value proposition is, right? And go along with that. And so that was just one way we sort of disrupted legacy databases by bringing in that PL SQL in 2018. But now we're really focused since 2020 on disrupting cloud databases. Those cloud database providers with that cross-cloud open source database that we run on Kubernetes with, that lower TCO that I mentioned. And this year in 2023, what we're doing with open source databases is going to be really exciting.
Yeah, that's a good point to make there. And, I think about, again, the evolution of the industry. Maybe I'll throw it over to Rob and Jessani to comment on this. Every company is going to be in a different place, depending upon their tech stack, what they have going on, which direction they're going in the future. But it is important to really understand, what are your core strengths? What are your skills? What is your business model? This is something that I always advocate for an information strategy group in every company, because things are changing, and they're changing very, very quickly. And it can be difficult to kind of pivot or to change the direction of your company. What's some advice you give to prospects, Robin, when you're talking to them, to help them understand why a particular path makes more sense for them?
So, we're really interested in helping our customers, and we've helped thousands of customers over the years unlock the value and growth potential from solving complex problems and finding new insights, all using data and analytics. And so for us, we are really stressing to our customers that as they are adopting the cloud, they're also adopting their modernization journey. So it's not just a move what you have today into the cloud. It's you need to do some refactoring. You may need to make some changes to how you do things, or what things you want to do, and what your business analysts and data scientists want to do to get the most value, to unlock the data, to be able to process the analytics and deploy them and operationalize them, which is another key area that others fail at. Within our suite of ClearScape Analytics, we cover the whole gamut, allowing them to start with data prep. Most of our customers can do data prep 70% faster than other competitors, and a better price performance, right? More cost effectively. All the way through operationalization, being able to build and score a model and operationalize it and have it automatically monitored within the database. Really exciting stuff as customers and prospects are looking to migrate and transform their businesses.
Yeah. Well, everything is changing. That's what I was saying at the start of the show here, Tony. And that is the exciting part and the harrowing part, I think, of being a CIO or a CTO these days, because boy, a database choice you don't make every day, you don't make every week, you don't make every month, you make it once every X number of years. And then you kind of stick with it and figure out a way. And then you want to buy not just what they have today, but you want to understand their vision and where they're going. I think that's probably a big part of the equation today. What do you think, Tony?
Well, number one, it's a platform decision. It may sound cliche. It's a platform decision, just like if you're choosing an enterprise application. That's a platform decision. Just if choosing a specific, hyperscaler, that's a platform decision. And the thing is, there is nothing wrong with that basically, because frankly, unless you are the ultimate living off the grid where you invent everything down to the operating system, you have to depend on some strategic suppliers that basically define what is going to be your app platform, what is going to be your operating platform, what's going to be your cloud platform, what's going to be your data platform. That's going to dictate drive the context of all the choices of, let's say, like all the third-party tools and applications that you put in. So I mean, and the other thing is that with what's interesting is that with cloud, it has really multiplied the choices, because from the same provider you can put, you get many different forms of let's say of database, for instance. I mean, like, it reminds me of the old days, I mean, in the pre-cloud days with Teradata, when you had appliances, you had you had different workload optimized appliances based on specific use cases of your customers. Some basically had compute intensive problems, other had basically IO intensive problems, others required more generalized workloads. Same thing in terms of Manjot, the way basically MariaDB has delivered its cloud service, and that it's not a single vanilla cloud service. So the fact is that you have a world of choices, and in the cloud you'll get lots of choices in terms of not only what the platform can do, but also, like, you may have choices, for instance, in the types of let's say compute instances or storage instances. And the fact is that, and the other thing also is that if you're doing analytics, you have a choice in terms of, do you run it all in database? Are you going to federate this? And there's no single answer that applies to everything. It's like EPA gas mileage. Your mileage will vary depending on the requirements of your workload, and also increasingly where you can process that workload. Because if you're a global company, you may be operating in countries that may have very specific restrictions on where this data can go. And even within the US, different states now have different privacy laws. California has enacted CCPA. I mean, I'm not an expert on this. I have some colleagues of mine in the industry who can give you the full, the full 9 yards on that. But the fact is, even within the US, there are varying regimes with regard to data privacy and where data can go. So the thing is that there are just many, many choices. The good news is that there are many choices. The bad news is that there are many choices.
Right. No, that's exactly right. And Manjot, maybe I'll throw it over to you, because multimodal is a topic of discussion these days. And there are some old multimodal databases, but that seems to be a direction. Again, probably 5 years ago, I remember talking to some folks. Monty Zwieben, I think, was the first one who was talking to me about a sort of sniffer that would be, that's in the technology and gets the query and says, okay, is this an analytic query? Or is this an operational query? Oh, it's operational, go this way. It's analytical, okay, go that way. That's a pretty clever way to look at things. Now in production, how does it work? I don't know. But the point is, multimodal is a very popular conversation these days. And I think that's part of what you folks offer as well, right, Manjot?
Yeah. And we started that with an innovative approach with Column Store, right? So you could have InnoDB, which is our OLTP and our focus on operational transactions, and Column Store being our OLAP product. But now with Expand, we have columnar indexes, and what that means is you can run some of that operational OLAP within your OLTP database. So while our focus is operational or OLTP processing, our operational OLAP capabilities are there. And with SkySQL, it's highly consumable on the cloud of your choice. And I think that goes back to what Tony was saying, because you were talking about how people will pick a platform or a single cloud. I wondered during that answer, how is that different from, say, the legacy databases, right? Where people would get locked in for years, as you mentioned.
Right.
Because what we're seeing is developers don't want to work with those legacy vendors. They're complicated and complex, right? And are the clouds, the hyperscalers, going that way? And is that possibly why our second generation clouds are so successful?
That's a very interesting point. Lock-in scares the daylights out of people, especially veterans who have been burned before. I mean, trust me, it's like a marriage that you realize 1 year in, like, oh, this is not going to work, and you're stuck there because you have the same house and you got to live there with this person all the time.
Yeah.
It does not work out very well. We're almost at the end here, but podcast bonus segment is coming up next. Look all these folks up online, folks. Tony Baer, that's Baer of DBInsight, Manjot Singh, and of course Robin Jessani. And we want to know what you want to know. Send me an email, info@dmradio.biz. We'll talk to you next time. You've been listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, time for the podcast bonus segment here on a fantastic episode of DM Radio. We still have Manjot Singh and Tony Baer with us. And Manjot, you were making a point right at the end of the show there of the main regular show about something that happened, and old Larry Ellison, he copied something you did. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so we were talking about how our focus is operational or OLTP processing, right? But we have that OLAP capability, whether it's in MariaDB Enterprise or Expand, and that gives us that success with large and small companies, because there's only some other products only large companies can use, right? And a number of them come to mind. So Larry Ellison thought that was a good idea. So he's moved MySQL to be HeatWave. And we've had that for years in server and column store on premises. And now SkySQL has that capability along with serverless analytics. So you have a lot of flexibility with your OLAP and your transactional processing. So, and it's interesting because if you try to go, like you had mentioned at the beginning of the show, if you try to download MySQL now, you have to go through all these HeatWave screens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what they do. They just kind of hide it. You got to
Exactly.
like navigate all around to get to it, and you download it and set it up, and certain things work, certain things don't work. It always requires maintenance, right? I mean, we have a technology that we built, and we have to pay developers to check the latest libraries and things. We're using MongoDB, in fact, in the background. But things change, and you have to constantly be aware of that. And I'll throw it over to you, Tony, to comment on. The world keeps changing around us, and it is imperative that we pay attention to what is changing around us to know where to focus our attention, right? To know, do we need to look at a new database solution, or how are we going to migrate? Things change, and you have to be cognizant of the impact of the change around you, right, Tony?
Well, you also have to be cognizant of where your business is going. And if there's anything we've learned in the last few years, it's that external factors. Let's say, we'll let the gorilla out there. The pandemic forced a lot of businesses to reevaluate how they conduct business and what their business is.
Right.
And you see also systemic change in other industries. And I'll give another example, which is the automotive industry, which is the move to electric cars. That changes the relationship between the automaker and the end customer, which traditionally was owned by the dealer. Because now you have this thing called software upgrades. Guess what? The car industry is now becoming, a software industry. And so that redounds to basically how you look at, make your database decision. And the thing is, and it means, for instance, do we need to now incorporate streaming? Do it, with machine learning, what level of skills do we have in our organization? Do we have data scientists, or do we need to basically take advantage of, let's say, off the shelf basically algorithms that are made available and therefore working more of let's say like an AutoML type of situation. Also, it means do we need to where we conduct machine learning, do we want to conduct it in database, or is it more efficient to conduct it outside the database? And there are arguments going both ways on that. And also, if you do it in database, is that lock-in? So I mean, it's there. And again, there's no single right answer. And the thing is that just to kind of give the other side, the flip side of the coin, what Manjot was saying, it's like, yes, congratulations to MariaDB, folks at MariaDB, you thought of this first. Congratulations to Oracle in terms of they took your innovation and they took the idea that you folks were doing, and they applied it to what they were doing with MySQL, and came out with a very distinctive product, which includes, for instance, the ability to do machine learning in database. Now, so the thing is that, again, there's just it goes back to choices. And I know at the end of the regular broadcast, Eric, you were saying, well, gee, you're kind of stuck with what you have. On the other hand, you have all these choices here, so it gives you a lot of options. And the fact is also in the cloud, there is especially, we have like a lot of these open lakehouse formats that are opening up. It does open up possibilities that, for instance, I can store data in a canonical format, and I can use the query engine of my choice. So that actually, I was talking before about the freedom and the oppression of choices. Ultimately, I will basically err on the side of freedom. I will say though, and I'm going to close with this, and this is a rant that I came out with at the beginning of the year. We need to simplify the modern data stack.
Yes.
So basically customers can make good choices, because the problem is that we've gotten, when you look at what we call the modern data stack, which has this incredible, this very complex tool chains, they grow these great capabilities, but customers have to, then the burden of integration falls on their shoulders. And so it's incumbent on both the the database suppliers, and it's incumbent on basically all the tool suppliers to literally get your act literally together and make this simpler. And in the cloud, you can do that.
That's a great way to close. Well, folks, look these guys up online. Like I said, Manjot Singh from MariaDB, Tony Baer from DBInsights, and Robin Jessani from Teradata. Great advice from our experts. We'll talk to you next time, folks. You've been listening to DM Radio.